Hi there, welcome back to our class in rhetorical theory. Here in lecture number 2 we will talk about the ideas of what we call orality and another term or an idea you've heard of, the idea of sophistry or the practice of sophistry. You're a lot more familiar with both than perhaps you are with the terms by which we scholars refer to them. Okay, the idea of orality comes in contrast with literacy. And here we've got a picture of a Lakota storyteller telling the young people there in his community stories of the past of heroes, of people who made mistakes and failed, the purpose of which to teach them important lessons about what it means to be a member of their community, to teach them virtues, and it's done through storytelling. In cultures like this one, they primarily don't use writing. They use oral expressions, oral speaking. Things are held in the memory, ideas, important traditions for their culture. Along with this can come, various activities like dancing, not just storytelling, singing, songs. Songs are probably a more elaborate form of this, especially the ballad. And this culture, many cultures do not use a writing system. Of course they do now, and most cultures do now, but if we go back just 100 years, here in the United States, there were many cultures, Native Americans, that did not use a system of writing. Many of the slaves who were forcibly brought here from Africa and put to work came from cultures with no system of writing, and their traditions of storytelling persisted and even persist to this day in many of these cultures. But I want to suggest to you here that even people from a culture that highly values literature and uses literature and literacy to maintain their ways, their culture, to teach virtues, to teach truths, to teach how to live and be the right kind of citizen. We all started out in a very oral world prior to our learning to read and write. I'm giving you a reading about this, and I think you'll find it fascinating. So orality is simply the ways of managing knowledge and verbalization in primary oral cultures. United States culture is no longer a primary or oral culture. In fact, it probably hasn't been since our ancestors go back to Europe and were poor enough that they never learned to read and write. Then you're in a primary oral culture, but you know about writing. There are books, and there are these special people who know how to read. It's almost a kind of magic to open the book and tell the story. In a literate culture, more and more people learn to read and write, and we are, not as literate in the United States as we once were. Estimated that 90 to 95% in colonial America, 90 to 95% of people could read and write. It was important to learn to read and write to them in that culture. Our culture today, literacy rates are much lower, due to poverty perhaps. But the ideas of orality, the forms of orality that help us remember things and tell stories have been present with us from childhood and will persist throughout our lives. So, moving on here. So, orality is using the methods of oral storytelling. Did you know epic poems can be memorized? A poem like the Iliad, if you've read it, it's a fairly thick book now, but these oral bards used to travel around Macedonia and Greece, that area of the world, retelling this story over and over. They go from one village to the next. I got a picture of one of them on that first page here, where he's standing there with it's called a rhapsod, his stick, and he would tap that. Interesting, rap music today, very much about storytelling, as you'll see, uses a lot of the forms of structure that oral cultures are prone to use. So, getting back here, you can memorize incredible amounts of knowledge, more substance by using techniques that are used in these oral cultures. Language becomes beautiful in oral cultures. It becomes fun. There's a lot of poetic devices that get built into the storytelling, into songs, of course. We're familiar with that. You know, you've noticed how you can remember lyrics to your favorite songs word for word. You don't have to hear it too many times, and once you start singing it along yourself, it gets stuck in your brain. Here I am, turning 60 a few weeks ago, and you know, go around town, go here and there, and they play these songs from back in the 70s. And good grief, I know every word, I know every line, because I listened to them over and over. And those songs are constructed in this formulaic, poetic way. So using these kind of techniques, we can recall things that are essential. And they become essential because we put them into this form in a thoughtful culture. Our culture often uses it just for entertainment. And even there's jokes about these songs that get stuck in your head. You can't get them out. Often they're nonsense songs. And it's a little irritating sometimes when these get stuck in your head. Well, that's kind of the idea of orality here. How do we work with language to get things lodged in our memories so we can recall it? It was very important at one time, not so much today, unless you want to become good at rhetoric. And then I urge you to take this seriously, and you'll find throughout good speeches, good public relation campaigns, marketing campaigns, you know, the idea of using slogans, using sayings, and using clever language use, just it really helps people remember. And there's also that aspect here we've talked about last week of beauty and truth getting interlinked. And something that rhymes and has metering to it is pleasant to listen to, it's fun, it has that ring of truth to it. Well, this comes out of the oral culture that we all grew up in until we started learning to read at age 6 or 7. By the time we get about 8 years old, our brain actually begins to shift away from the things we're going to talk about here in a minute, these forms of expression, and shift towards more literate forms of thinking. And I think we lose much by doing that. Okay, some of these forms of thought and expression literally evolved into what we call rhetorical figuration. And here's 5 different devices. There's probably 25 of these, maybe more, 40 or 50 that I think. I've got one book called Rhetorical Figuration that may have about 50 ways to turn a phrase. Yeah, look at that mnemonic device there. That was the title of the book. Antithesis, where you compare two things, the good and the bad, good and evil, and hold them up for comparison and put them into verbal form. Chiasmus is one that does the same thing. It holds up two ideas, but it puts them into reverse order as you go through a statement. John Kennedy famously said, here's an example of it, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Country, you, country. An A-B-B-A structural form. It sounds nice. It has a ring of truth to it. Anaphora is when we use the same phrase, typically at the beginning of sentences within a speech, within something. Let me think of a quick example here. Martin Luther King really liked this one, and he used its other corollary where you put the phrase at the end. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day. And he has about 6 different aspects of that dream he shares, all leading each one with I have a dream. And then as he gets into the whole phrasing, closing the statement with I have a dream today. And then he moves on. He goes on and tells more about it. Irony is when you mean exactly the opposite of what you said. There's another rhetorical figure. And it sticks in the memory. It makes a point. It's got a force to it that simply saying what you mean doesn't have. Climax is a rhetorical figure where we lead up to greater and greater ideas within the sentence or paragraph structure. And we're going to have a little exercise on these figures here in class, And just want you to play with them and get familiar with them and start finding your favorites and start working them into your writing, into any form of expression or discourse you're called upon to share with other people, a speech, just saying a few words somewhere, not a formal speech, and you'll find this very useful and a lot of fun. Okay, so there's about 50 of these. I'll post that book on the website, just a copy of the cover. You'll have to find your own copy there. Okay, let's go on with orality a little bit, and not sure how well you can read these words here. With HD it's a little easier. I'm just going to talk briefly about them, but this is the guts of the reading that you're doing for this week. Mnemonics and formulas. Mnemonics, the science of creating discourse so that it gets stuck in the memory, typically through repetitive form, and that can be seen to structure language here. There's also just formulas that can go with this. And so Walter Ong, who wrote this piece that you're reading, chapter, I think, 3 from his book, was a Jesuit scholar that just almost an anthropologist, I suppose, but wrote this very interesting book called Orality and Literacy, and he was the first one to really pull together all the research of a lot of different people and put it into a form that you can grasp, get a hold of, and understand. But he says there's 9 different characteristics of oral thought and expression, and you can look down the list here. It's additive rather than subordinative. You just keep adding things on to the story, and then they did this, and then this happened, and then they did this, rather than using these subordinate clauses and the more complex forms of structure that we use with writing. It's aggregative rather than analytic. We're just looking at the story and kind of letting it sink in. We're not digging in and dissecting through an analysis. Redundancy is another one. We say things over and over. Memory needs repetition, and so often we chain things together. You know, God was the father of Adam. Adam was the father of Seth. Seth was the father of, and we go right down the list of the genealogy of family names that we want to remember, repeating each one twice, once in each statement. Conservative. Oral cultures tend to live kind of in the here and now. What's important to them are the things that are relevant here and now, and they change very slowly. And so that's where the conservative part comes in. Okay, you can read through the rest of these in the book. I don't want to spend too much time in this, but I think you're getting the idea. And when you put together discourse using these forms, it takes on a power that a lot of writing just doesn't have, a lot of speeches just don't have. And you can tell the speech by a speechwriter who understands these concepts either through formal study like you're doing now, or just through having a nice sense of artistry. My son has never really left that oral world. He learned to read and write very well, but he's really stayed close to that. It's interesting. He would make a good speechwriter if he ever went that direction. Okay, and it's interesting, these stories and songs, like the Iliad, we have these bards going around, I say, performing the Iliad for the next town and the next town, and they make their money that way. They never tell the story the same way twice. We're not going for absolute recall. We're going for hanging on to the important things. What did somebody do that was heroic that we all need to learn lessons from? And that's the heart of a story like this. And so it doesn't matter if you don't get it exactly right the next time. That was never the point of it. The point was to hold on to the main idea. And this method does it very well without ever needing to read and write. All right. So orality was a feature of almost all cultures at one time in history. Cuneiform writing made it difficult. The invention of the phonetic alphabet in the Mediterranean in about 700 BC was just a fantastic breakthrough in technology. And all of a sudden, you didn't have to be a career scholar studying cuneiform writing or studying hieroglyphics or these complex writing systems that have a symbol for each word. All of a sudden, writing became symbols that mean sounds, and we can put words together using these small little symbols, and all of a sudden, literally a 5-year-old could learn to read and write. You didn't have to be in your 20s and probably 30 years old before you were fluent at it. And that radically changed cultures. As Greek culture evolved, and we look at the Greeks a lot in the field of rhetoric because they were the ones that turned it into a field of study for us and really outlined all of the principles. But in the process of going from wily Odysseus in the Iliad, who was a really good speaker to the troops and to the other people, he was very persuasive, but he didn't have formal training in rhetoric from Aristotle. He lived 1,000 years before that, or 800 years before that. But clever people who just would have a knack for doing oratory started formalizing this art, using these principles of mnemonics, formulaic sayings, all of the oral characteristics of oral thought and expression. And that's what it took to become a good speaker, public speaker, was to have a grasp on all of that. So this kind of led right to a class of citizens in the Mediterranean world that were very interesting, especially as new forms of government where they were breaking away from all-powerful rulers in monarchical type situations and forming more democratic type societies. A group of people appeared starting in Sicily. They were called the Sophists eventually. They weren't called the Sophists right away. Sophist comes from the Greek word sophos, which means wisdom, like in a college sophomore. Yeah, that's a joke. But I hope you are becoming. But, you know, go back 500 years, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, yeah. You should start getting a little bit of wisdom by the time you're in your second year of college. And sophistry really got summed up in a line from this fellow right here named Protagoras. And Protagoras actually was accused of this. It's a fragment from one of his writings, and then Plato picked up on this and accused him of this. But making the weaker case or argument appear to be the stronger. Making the weaker appear to be the stronger reason is how it's put. And that's an interesting idea. Somebody's right and has all the facts behind them, but if you're going to argue with them and will do anything to win, there are techniques that these people, these sophists, learned to make a weaker case appear to be the stronger case, and they would persuade a judicial body, a deliberative body, to make a decision in your favor. These sophists ended up teaching oratory. They taught argumentation. They all had kind of a different take on it, but they were literally a group of teachers. Several of them traveled a lot. Protagoras here stayed around Athens most of the time. He was a contemporary of Plato's, and but they weren't all men here. It's an interesting thing. Aspasia, I think is how you pronounce her name, was a woman who taught rhetoric, and one of her students was Socrates. Interesting image right here. She kept a brothel in her house, had women that worked for her there at the house, and all of the people would come to study at her house. I'm sure that's all they did. And but Socrates was among them, and a lot of other leading Athenians, and she was married to a fellow named Pericles, who became the leader of Athens, a very strong military leader, and really strengthened the city-state and made it a force in the Greek Mediterranean world. So two of these early sophists, I think they were before Aspasia, were named Corax and Tisias. And the story about them is somewhat amusing. They lived in Syracuse, and there was a Greek colony there, Greek-speaking people in Syracuse, which is on Sicily, the island that makes the toe of the Italian boot there in the Mediterranean. And Corax began teaching people how to argue in the law courts. Sicily had been under the rule of a despotic monarch who took away people's land, and after that fellow died, people wanted their family land back that they'd had for generations. And so they went to court to sue the people who held their land, being given to it as a favor by the ruler, and have the judge in the newly formed government take back your title to your land and give it to the original family. So Corax started a business, a school, teaching these people how to go into court and make your case and win your case. Well, a young man came to Corax, his name was Tisius, and he wanted to learn this art and be one of his students. And Corax says, great, I'll teach you, and you don't have to pay me until you become a lawyer, basically, and win your first case, and then you can pay me out of your proceeds. Tisius said, okay. And then he went to Corax's school and graduated. I don't know how long that took, maybe just a month or 3 months. I'm not going to guess here, maybe a year. And he was afraid to go into court and take on his first case. He never paid Corax then. So Corax took him to court to get his fee for teaching him, to get that tuition. And Tisius argued that, well, actually Corax started the argument and told the judge, I taught him the art of rhetoric, and now he needs to pay his fee. And if you hear me out and you hear Tisius out, if Tisius persuades you to rule in his favor, well, it proves that I taught him well, and he needs to pay me that fee. And Tisius replied, I never took my first case to court because you didn't teach me rhetoric very well. And all you taught me was how to flatter people and to trick them. So if I win this case, Your Honor, it's not because he taught me rhetoric. It's just because I'm an honest person who has somewhat of a gift for expressing myself. And therefore, I should win and not have to pay the fee. Well, what does a judge do with that? And so the judge just simply said, and Corax, his name actually means crow in the Greek language. Tisius means egg. And so the judge just says, bad crow, bad egg. And he dismisses the case and throws him out. Tisius ended up hanging out with a guy named Gorgias here. There's a bust of him, probably what he looked like. And I think a lot of these ancient statues were based, if not carved by people who knew and remembered, but soon afterwards, and pretty trustworthy images perhaps. Gorgias studied with Tisius, and Gorgias learned this art, and he became a performer and started a school of teaching people rhetoric, and he traveled from Syracuse over to Athens and started teaching rhetoric and teaching people how to speak, how to do well in the law courts. And by this time, Athenian democracy is solidifying, and being a good speaker in the public arena where people deliberate, and in a pure democracy, you listen to both sides of a case, you cast your vote, and that's what the entire nation does. We don't have a democracy today. We have a republic where we have representatives who go and listen because we can't all fit. So Gorgias started teaching rhetoric, and Gorgias would put on these performances where he would deliver a speech, and his speeches were logical, they made sense, they were persuasive, and he incorporated a lot of artistic aspects using these forms of oral thought and expression. I want to read you here just an excerpt from his speech. I'll put this up on our website also. And this is from one of the only speeches of the sophists that has survived in written form. It's called Encomium of Helen, where it's kind of a defense of Helen. And Helen was the woman here, Helen of Troy, who was, if you've watched the movie Troy, it's pretty close to the story, but she was the most beautiful woman in the world and ended up being taken away by Paris to the city of Troy, but she was the wife of Menelaus. Okay, you know that story, I think. If not, watch the movies, they're fascinating. So Gorgias starts. This is just a flavor of his speaking style here. Translated from Greek, not quite literally, but trying to incorporate the poetic value of the text. What is becoming to a city is manpower, to a body, beauty, to a soul, wisdom, to an action, virtue, to a speech, truth, and the opposites of these are unbecoming. Man and woman, and speech and deed, and city and object should be honored with praise, if praiseworthy, and incur blame, if blameworthy. For it is an equal error to blame the praisable, and to praise the blamable. It is the duty of one and the same man to both speak to the needful rightly, and to refute the unrightfully spoken. Thus, it is right to refute those who rebuke Helen, a woman about whom the testimony of inspired poets has become univocal and unanimous, as had the ill omen of her name, which has become a reminder of misfortunes. For my part, by introducing some reasoning into my speech, I wish to free the accused of blame, and having reproved her detractors as prevaricators, and proved the truth, to free her from their ignorance. You know, I've not heard a political candidate in this country speak in a style like this ever. I hear in political speeches a lot of these figures of speech. I sense and can point out some of the structural elements that come out of orality, but nothing to this degree where the entire speech is constructed with that style. Someone who really studied speaking, this is probably where you might end up and where it would take you. Okay, so the sophists. Sophism, because of that one statement by Plato, making the worse appear the better reason. Sophistry took on a bad name, persuading by deceit, using flattery, whatever it takes to get people by their own will. Remember, we talked last time, we have no coercion going on in real persuasion. But you can lie, cheat, you can falsify facts. There's a lot of tactics that make the worse appear the better reason. And these became synonymous with the term sophistry, the sophists, and to call somebody a sophist probably by the 1500s was a great insult. You're basically calling that person somebody who's conning other people. Not a nice name to be called. And this was made famous by the poet John Milton. I think he wrote Paradise Lost toward the 1670s. I'm not sure of the exact date. It was one of the later things that he wrote. But there's a section in the poem. All of the angels are coming in front of God to share their ideas about things. And finally, this fallen angel, Belial, the devil, shows up. And it's interesting how Milton describes him, and this is the way sophism has become in Western society. Milton wrote, "Up rose Belial, in act more graceful and humane. A fairer person lost not heaven, he seemed, for dignity composed and high exploit. But all was false and hollow, though his tongue dropped manna, and could make the worse appear the better reason, to perplex and dash maturest counsels, for his thoughts were low, yet he pleased the ear, and with persuasive accent thus began." Following this is a speech by Belial. But interesting ideas here. Up rose Belial, graceful. He rose up. There's an activity there, there's action. Good orators have always been very healthy, active people. Just the bodily strength, being in good shape and movement is just really helps that impact your audience with just something a little bit more than perhaps somebody who has all the right words but is, overweight and moves slow and cumbersomely. Being fit and trim, and almost any motivational speaker you find that has many of these attributes They're in really good shape, and they keep themselves in good shape, fit and trim. Good looking, a fair person, not lost heaven. All of our newscasters, very good looking. They're just reading the scripts, but they do it so well. Many motivational speakers, also very good looking people. They have a dignified aspect about them, but it's not true. It's false, it's hollow, it's all acting, it's a show. His tongue dropped manna, and I think of the script from Gorgias here, just with the rhyming and the metering and just the nice imagery that comes through his words. And then there's that classic quote from Plato, from John Milton, and could make the worse appear the better reason. And he's identifying Belial as a sophist right here and now, and describing sophism as we go here, to perplex and dash maturest counsel. Yeah, a sophist, a good one, can talk circles around you, and if you're a little bit slower thinking and haven't quite got your words ready, you don't have a chance with people listening. You're gonna look foolish, and the other person's gonna sound very eloquent, and that eloquence makes them sound right. He pleased the ear, and with persuasive accent thus began. That persuasive accent, British accent today seems to be that almost anything can be said with a British accent, and it just sounds intelligent and interesting. I wish I could do a better British accent, but that's why so many narrators for documentaries are British and have that accent. So that's one example of a persuasive accent here for Americans living in the United States. For people in Great Britain, well, maybe an educated accent is what we're looking for, if that's the case. But all of these concepts here are worked out differently in any culture we're in. But the basic heart of them is pretty, almost an universal way to look at things. All right, thanks a lot, and I hope this makes sense to you and you have a good handle on this idea of orality and this primacy of language that goes right to the core, right to that inner 4-year-old of an audience, when you are able to use the kind of language and talk to them and communicate with them in a form that resonates so deeply. And then as well, the idea of sophism, the dark side of this, using these characteristics about language, and we'll find out later, argumentation tactics and tricks that can confuse people that haven't studied enough to see through it, or don't have a sharp enough mind to intuitively just say there's something wrong with what you're saying. I just don't quite buy your sales pitch. I think I'm going to lose my money if I do what you say. So beware of the sophists, and embrace the idea of orality, and we're all still little children inside and respond very well to music, dancing, the oral nature of language, poetry and poetics. All of this is just wonderfully artistic and brings that ring of truth with it when we hear it. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll talk to you in our next lecture.